In April 1970, 3 men were trapped in a freezing, dying metal tube 200,000 miles from Earth. The world held its breath as Apollo 13 began to suffocate. NASA's best means were frantic, looking for a miracle. But the miracle had actually been delivered nearly a decade earlier by a man who was told to shut up, stay in his lane, and follow orders. Most people think the Apollo missions were a smooth path of genius and American grit. They weren't. They were a battleground of egos. And at the center of that battle was a mid-level engineer named John Houbolt. If John Houbolt had followed the rules, if he had respected the chain of command like he was told, James Lovell, Fred Haise, and Jack Swigert would never have come home. Their names would be etched on a tombstone orbiting the moon. You clicked on this video because you want to know how one man's insubordination saved the most famous space rescue in history. By the end of this story, you will see exactly how close we came to a national tragedy, and why disobeying orders is sometimes the most heroic thing a person can do. And as we dive into these classified rooms of the 1960s, you might find your hand instinctively moving toward the like button. Don't fight it. That's just your brain recognizing that the truth deserves to be shared. It's a small click for you, but it helps this mission reach more people. To understand the rescue, we have to understand the mistake. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy threw down the gauntlet, the moon. By the end of the decade, NASA was a brand new agency, and they were terrified. They had no idea how to get there. The P-bosses at NASA, men like Wernher von Braun, the legendary rocket scientist, had a plan. It was called direct ascent. It was simple, grand, and incredibly dangerous. The idea was to build a rocket so massive, the Nova rocket, that it would fly straight to the moon, land the entire ship on the surface, and then blast that same massive ship back to Earth. It was the brute force method. But John Houbolt, an engineer at NASA's Langley Research Center, sat down with a slide rule and a pencil. He began to sweat. The math didn't work. To land a ship that big on the moon, you'd need a landing gear the size of a building. The fuel requirements were impossible. It was a death trap plan. Houbolt realized that if NASA followed the official orders, the astronauts wouldn't just fail. They would crash into the lunar surface because the craft would be too heavy to control. He had a different idea, a crazy idea. Lunar orbit rendezvous. Instead of taking the whole house to the moon, you take a small tent, the lunar module. You leave the main ship in orbit, drop the small tent down, then fly the tent back up to meet the ship. He presented it to his superiors. They laughed. They called him a crankler. They told him his math was flawed. And then they gave him a direct order. Stop talking about it. John Houbolt was a family man. He had a career to think about. In the government world of the 1960s, skipping your boss to talk to the big boss was a career suicide move. It was the ultimate no-no, but Houbolt couldn't sleep. He saw the faces of the astronauts. He knew they were being sent to their deaths by bureaucratic ego. On November 15, 1961, John Houbolt did the unthinkable. He bypassed his boss. He bypassed his boss's boss. He wrote a 9-page letter directly to the Associate Administrator of NASA, Robert Seamans. The letter didn't start with, "Dear Sir." It started with a cry for help. Somewhat as a voice in the wilderness, Houbolt wrote, "I would like to pass on a few thoughts." He then proceeded to tear the official NASA plan to pieces. He used words like ridiculous and impossible. He accused NASA management of being blinded by their own pride. Voice becomes more intense. This was a fireable offense. He was essentially calling the leaders of the space program incompetent. When the letter landed on Seamans' desk, the room went cold. Houbolt's immediate supervisors were humiliated. They wanted his head on a platter. But Seamans read the math. He realized Hobolt was right. If Hobolt hadn't disobeyed the chain of command, NASA would have spent the next 5 years building a rocket that could never land. They would have missed the decade deadline, or worse, they would have tried it and watched 3 men die on live television. Because of his insubordination, the lunar module was born, the tiny, spindly spider that would actually land on the moon. But Hobolt didn't just save the mission. He saved the lives of the crew of Apollo 13. Here is the part the history books often skip. Fast forward to 1970. Apollo 13. Houston, we've had a problem. An oxygen tank exploded. The command module, the main ship, was dying. Power was failing. Air was running out. Under the direct ascent plan, the one the bosses wanted, there would have been nothing else. Just one ship. If it broke, you died. But because Hobolt had fought for lunar orbit rendezvous, there was a second independent ship attached to the stack, the lunar module. The lunar module had its own batteries, its own oxygen, its own engine. For 4 days, that tiny tent that Hobolt fought for became the lifeboat. The crew huddled inside it. They used the lunar module's engine to slingshot around the moon and head for home. If John Hobolt had been a good employee, if he had followed orders and stayed silent in 1991, there would have been no lunar module. Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert would have drifted into the void, silent forever. John Hobolt's disobedience gave them a second chance. It gave them a lifeboat. Softly, it's funny how the world works. Sometimes the person everyone calls difficult is the only one who can see the cliff everyone else is walking toward. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the hidden heroes of space, you might find that subscribing to this channel feels like a natural next. When Apollo 11 finally landed in 1969, and again, when Apollo 13 returned safely in 1970, John Hobolt didn't seek the cameras. He didn't stand on a stage. Werner von Braun, the man who had initially dismissed him, eventually walked up to Hobolt, shook his hand, and said, "Thank you, John. You were right. We were wrong." John Hobolt passed away in 2014. He wasn't a household name. He didn't have the right stuff of an astronaut. He had the right stuff of an engineer. The courage to stand by the truth, even when the truth was unpopular. He proved that the most important part of a spaceship isn't the engine or the heat shield. It's the integrity of the people who design it. He disobeyed orders. He risked his career. He called his bosses out. And in doing so, he saved 3 men from a cold, lonely death in the blackness of space. The next time you're told to just follow orders, remember John Hobolt. Remember the man in the wilderness. Because sometimes, the only thing standing between a miracle and a disaster is one person willing to say no. Thank you for staying through this journey. Your time is the most valuable thing you have, and I'm honored you spent it here. I'll see you in the next mission.